Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant to be heard, not by you, not by anyone outside the locked iron gates of America's forgotten asylums. For decades, official reports painted them as places of mercy, sanctuaries for the broken, sanctuaries for the lost. But inside those walls, beneath the clinical language of progress, something darker was unfolding. Files were shredded, ledgers burned, families silenced, and yet some fragments survived, enough to tear open the mask. Picture it, a grand brick hospital standing on a hilltop in the 1940s. Its windows glow with golden light, its lawns trimmed like a university campus. Mothers walked their children past those walls and whispered, "That's where they heal minds." But what the public never saw were the screams that echoed in the basements at night. Here is the truth. These places were not just hospitals, they were laboratories. Living vaults where human beings became raw material for experiments too dangerous to admit in daylight. What the state called treatment was in reality psychological warfare conducted on its own citizens. Why do you think so much was erased? Why do you think so many documents vanished into fire? Because if you truly knew, how far they went, the myth of American benevolence would crack beyond repair. This is the descent, and once you hear it, there's no going back. The first thing you must understand is the architecture of illusion. The asylums were built like temples. Long columns, cathedral ceilings, wide reception halls where sunlight poured through stained glass. They looked like sanctuaries because that was the bait. You don't hand over your mother, your wife, your brother to a place that looks like a dungeon. You hand them over to a place that looks like salvation. But salvation was a lie. Behind the polished corridors were locked doors. Behind those doors were laboratories. And in those laboratories, men in white coats began to rewire the human soul. Consider this. In the early 20th century, the asylum system was drowning, overcrowded, underfunded. Politicians promised science would fix what compassion could not, so they gave doctors unchecked authority. Authority to try anything, to cut, to shock, to drown, to burn. The result was a perfect storm. Desperate institutions, ambitious doctors, and patients who could not refuse. You need to grasp this clearly. Once someone entered those gates, they stopped being a citizen. Their name became a case number. Their rights dissolved into paperwork. And once reduced to paper, anything could be done to them in the name of medicine. There are journals, hidden for decades, that speak of it. Nurses writing in careful script about patients strapped into bathtubs for hours, water cooling around their bodies until their teeth chattered like bones breaking. Men placed into chemically induced comas over and over until they could no longer remember their own names. Children shocked with electricity because they cried too loudly. They called it treatment. But you and I know the truth. It was conditioning. Do you see it? These were not cures. These were experiments in control. Now imagine yourself there, walking through the corridor at midnight. The gas lamps hum. The air is damp, heavy. You pass ward after ward, men and women strapped to their beds, some muttering to themselves, some staring through the ceiling as if their soul has already left. The attendants do not whisper. They laugh. They bet on who will survive the next session. And somewhere, a doctor sharpens his instrument. He calls it a miracle. He tells his students that the patient will wake, better, quieter, more manageable. But what wakes is not the same person who went under. What wakes is an empty vessel. Now you see why they erased the records. Because if you knew that America, the land of freedom, the land of progress, turned its hospitals into theaters of cruelty, you would question everything else. You would begin to see the system itself for what it is, not designed to heal you, but to mold you, reshape you, silence you. This story begins in the asylum, but it doesn't end there. The same techniques that broke patients in locked wards became the foundation for psychological warfare, interrogation tactics, even the entertainment you consume today. The asylum was the testing ground. Society became the experiment. That is why you are here, not to hear history, but to recognize the pattern. Do you feel it yet? The unease, that crawling sensation in your chest that tells you something has always been wrong, but no one ever dared to name it. That is not paranoia, that is recognition. You are waking up, and the deeper we go, the more dangerous the truth becomes. Every dark age requires a priest, and in the American asylum system, that priest wore a white coat. His name was Walter Freeman. To the public he was a pioneer, the face of modern psychiatry. Newspapers praised him as a miracle worker, a man bold enough to conquer insanity itself. Families saw him as a savior, the man who would return their loved ones cleansed of sorrow, fear, or violence. His photos appeared in glossy magazines, sharp suit, instruments gleaming, eyes full of confidence. But here is the truth. Freeman was not a healer. He was a showman, a salesman of silence. His miracle was the lobotomy, a procedure so simple, so barbaric, that it required nothing more than an ice pick and a hammer. He would slide the pick beneath the eyelid, rest it against the thin plate of bone above the eye, and with one sharp strike, push it into the brain. A twist, a slice, and the patient was forever changed, but not healed. Do you feel the horror of that? The brain, the sacred temple of thought, violated in minutes by a man who treated it like clay. And when the patient awoke, something essential was gone. Rage, despair, resistance. Yes, silenced. But with them went laughter, curiosity, love. What was left was not a cure, but a hollowed vessel. Freeman justified it with numbers. He boasted of efficiency. Hundreds, then thousands of procedures performed across the nation. He traveled with his kit like a traveling preacher, moving from asylum to asylum, from courthouse to courthouse, spreading the gospel of lobotomy. He called it liberation. His critics called it mutilation. But the truth is worse than either word. Because Freeman understood something deeper, the lobotomy was not just a surgery. It was control made flesh. It turned restless children into obedient shadows. It turned difficult wives into docile companions. It turned veterans haunted by war into manageable husks. And for the state, that was enough. You see, the asylum was overcrowded. Thousands of bodies crammed into wards meant for hundreds. Administrators begged for solutions. Families pleaded for relief. Freeman delivered. After one strike of steel, a patient who had once screamed through the night would sit quietly in a chair, staring into the distance. To the staff, it was progress. To families, it was peace. But to those who lived it, it was annihilation. Among Freeman's youngest subjects was a boy named Howard Dully. He was 12 years old. 12. His stepmother found him difficult, disobedient, too full of energy, resistant to her commands. Freeman didn't hesitate. He saw a problem to be solved, not a child to be understood. With a few swift motions, Howard's brain was altered. His youth, his spark, his rebellion, all dissolved in silence. Howard later recalled fragments of the experience, pieces of memory like broken glass. He spoke of a hole, our feeling, a sense that something had been stolen before he could even name what it was. Childhood didn't end for him with adolescence. It ended with an ice pick, and Howard was not alone. Freeman performed thousands of lobotomies across the United States. Housewives, veterans, children, prisoners. No one was beyond his reach. He believed the human spirit itself could be tamed with steel, and America believed him. Do you see the deeper pattern yet? When society faces chaos, war, depression, unrest, the promise of control becomes irresistible. And control always demands sacrifice. The asylums became temples where human individuality was offered on the altar of order, and Freeman was the high priest wielding the blade. But it wasn't just him. Freeman was only the face. Behind him stood an entire system. Administrators eager to reduce overcrowding, politicians eager to prove progress, families eager for relief. And every signature on every consent form became a nail sealing the coffin of a human soul. Understand this. The lobotomy was never just about madness. It was about obedience. Think of the power it represents. A state that can take your child, your wife, your brother, and erase their will. A doctor who can strike your brain like a blacksmith strikes iron, reshaping you to fit the demands of society. And a culture that applauds, calling it medicine, calling it mercy, when in truth it was domination. The patients were not healed, They were erased. And in their silence, the system found its victory. But silence does not mean absence. It lingers. You can still feel it in the old wards, in the abandoned hospitals where sunlight falls on peeling paint. Stand there long enough, and you will sense it. The absence of voices that should have been laughing, singing, living. What remains is only the echo of compliance, the residue of a nation that once sacrificed its most vulnerable to the illusion of progress. And if you think this was only the past, think again. Because the philosophy of Freeman, the belief that obedience is better than individuality, that silence is better than struggle, never died. It simply changed its clothing. Today it hides in new words: therapy, medication, management. The language has evolved, but the underlying logic remains. Do you feel the weight of that realization? The ice pick is gone, but the hand that wielded it has never let go. Now I ask you, how far are you willing to go down this rabbit hole? Because the deeper we descend, the more the truth will demand of you. These experiments were not accidents. They were not mistakes. They were rehearsals. Rehearsals for a society built on control. You were never meant to know this, but now you do. And the question is, what will you do with it? Electricity was once worshipped as the fire of the gods. Harnessed in the 20th century, it became the power that lit cities, drove industry, and promised mankind dominion over nature itself. But inside America's asylums, that same force was twisted into something far darker. Electricity became not liberation, but submission. Electroconvulsive therapy, or ECT, was hailed as the crown jewel of modern psychiatry. The theory was elegant in its simplicity. If seizures could reset a broken mind, then controlled seizures, delivered by precise jolts of current, could cure madness. It sounded clean, scientific, almost visionary. Doctors dressed it in language of rebirth, calling it a reset, a chance for the mind to begin anew. But when you strip away the language, what remained was brutal. Imagine being strapped to a gurney, electrodes pressed against your temples, rubber forced between your teeth. You hear the hum of the machine, you smell the faint sting of ozone. Then a switch is thrown, and invisible lightning rips through your skull. Your body convulses against leather straps, teeth shatter, blood vessels burst in your eyes, and for a few seconds you become less than human, a body writhing under current, a puppet with its strings pulled by electricity. The reports described these sessions clinically, coldly. Marked convulsion, temporary calm, satisfactory response. That was the language administrators used, but families saw something different when they visited their loved ones afterward. They saw eyes vacant, memories fractured, personalities blunted. They saw mothers who no longer recognized their children, husbands who could no longer remember their wives, sons who stared at their fathers like strangers. One of those names was Sarah Mitchell, 34 years old. Her only crime was sorrow, persistent sadness, exhaustion from the weight of daily life. Her husband, assured by physicians that ECT was safe, signed the papers without hesitation. And so the treatments began. One shock, then another, 47 in total. By the end, Sarah was no longer Sarah. She smiled at strangers, forgot her children's birthdays, stared through her husband as if he were air. Her despair was gone, yes, but so was her identity. She had not been cured, she had been erased. And here lies the darker truth. In the asylum's logic, that was success. To them, silence equaled healing, calm equaled cure. They were not interested in restoring the full spectrum of humanity. They wanted compliance, manageability, patients who no longer fought, no longer screamed, no longer demanded, patients who sat quietly in their chairs, docile shadows of who they had once been. Do you understand now? Electroshock was never just about depression or schizophrenia or anxiety. It was about obedience. It was the state's way of breaking those who could not be controlled by words, by pills, by isolation, and it spread like wildfire. By the 1950s, machines humming with voltage sat in basements across the nation's hospitals. Doctors performed shocks in assembly line fashion, one patient after another. Some institutions shocked entire wards, Men, women, even children. None could refuse. The switch would be thrown and another soul would tremble under the current. Well, but ask yourself, why did America embrace this so quickly? Why did families hand over their loved ones with trust rather than suspicion? Because the illusion of progress was powerful. The world wanted to believe psychiatry had found answers. Newspapers praised the new science. Administrators reported high success rates. Politicians declared victory against madness. And the truth, the broken bodies, the erased memories, the stolen identities, remained locked inside hospital walls. The patients themselves became ghosts, trapped between life and oblivion. They could not testify, they could not resist, and so the myth of progress went unchallenged. Listen carefully now, because this is where the rabbit hole deepens. Electricity was not only a tool of medicine, it was a prototype of control. The same principles tested in asylum wards, shock, disorientation, enforced compliance, would later be used in military interrogations, in covert intelligence programs, even in techniques of mass persuasion. The asylum was not an isolated mistake. It was a laboratory. Think about it. What better testing ground than patients stripped of rights, silenced by stigma, abandoned by families? They could be experimented on endlessly, with no one to defend them. If the shock erased their memory, good. If it broke their will, better. If it killed them, there were always more bodies waiting in the next ward. Sarah Mitchell was not a tragedy. She was a data point. And you must see the pattern. Once you understand it, you cannot unsee it. The asylum did not invent cruelty. It perfected the art of disguising cruelty as compassion, of weaponizing science against those least able to resist, and once perfected, that art escaped the asylum and seeped into every institution around you. The question is, how much of your own obedience today, your quiet acceptance of authority, your willingness to conform, your silence in the face of absurdity, is the residue of this conditioning? Do you feel the weight of that realization? Do you sense deep in your bones that the same current which burned through patient skulls decades ago now hums invisibly through the structures of your own society? That what began in locked wards has become the architecture of control that surrounds you even now? You were never meant to know this. That's why they destroyed the files, why they burned too. He ledgers, why survivors were shamed into silence. But fragments remained, and those fragments are enough to reveal the truth. Electricity was not the cure, it was the leash. And here is where I must ask you something dangerous, something symbolic. If you are still with me, if you feel the descent tightening around your chest, then prove it. Write in the comments, twice, the phrase, "The silence was the cure." Write it once for the patients who lost their voices, and once for the part of yourself that refuses to remain blind. Do it not just for engagement. Do it as initiation. A ritual to mark the moment you stopped being an observer and began becoming something else, because from here, the descent only grows darker. We have spoken of steel and electricity. But next, we turn to a weapon far more insidious, a weapon that drowned genius, erased music, and turned life itself into a coma. Insulin. And once you see what it did, you will never look at medicine or control the same way again. If electricity was the whip, then insulin was the drowning pool. In the 1930s and 40s, a new miracle treatment swept through the corridors of psychiatry, insulin coma therapy. It promised renewal, rebirth, a way to shock the brain not with wires, but with chemistry. The theory was seductively simple: plunge the patient into the brink of death, then pull them back. In that brief liminal state, that crossing between life and oblivion, madness would be purged. But in practice, it was ritualized torture. Patients were injected with massive doses of insulin, enough to send the body into catastrophic collapse. The blood sugar plummeted, muscles seized, mouths frothed, bodies convulsed in violent spasms. Nurses would stand by, towels ready to wipe the foam from their lips. For hours, the patient would teeter on the razor's edge of coma. And then, at the appointed time, doctors would inject glucose, dragging them violently back into consciousness, again and again and again, not once, not twice, but sometimes dozens of times per patient. The theory was that the brain, shocked by repeated brushes with death, would somehow reboot itself, like a broken engine suddenly roaring back to life. Doctors pointed to patients who, after treatment, appeared calmer, quieter, subdued. They praised the results. They published papers. They called it progress. But what did those patients feel? Many remembered nothing, because memory itself was shattered. Others recalled fragments, suffocating darkness, choking seizures, waking up confused, weak, drenched in sweat. Some never woke at all, and yet families cheered. Administrators applauded. Politicians funded. Because once again the outcome, silence, docility, obedience, was mistaken for healing. One name lingers in the shadows of these wards. William Reed, a 22-year-old from Ohio, diagnosed with schizophrenia. His parents, desperate for hope, signed him into the asylum. Doctors recommended insulin coma therapy. For 3 months, William endured 60 induced comas, 60 rehearsals of death. When he was finally released, he was unrecognizable. His parents expected their son returned to them. Instead, they received a stranger, slow, passive, eyes glazed. The voices in his head were quiet, yes, but so was his laughter, his passion, his will. William was alive, but the man they had loved was gone. And what of those who didn't survive? Records are vague, because death was often listed as complications or cardiac failure. In truth, many were simply sacrificed to the experiment, bodies buried quietly, files closed, names erased. Understand the symbolism here. Insulin coma therapy was nothing less than ritualized drowning in the body's own collapse. Doctors staged rehearsals of death, believing madness could be washed away in the coma. But in truth, it wasn't madness that drowned. It was humanity itself. And when the body was not being drowned in sugar, it was drowned in water. Because alongside insulin therapy, Asylums wielded another weapon, hydrotherapy. On the surface, it looked benign. Who could object to baths, to water, to cleanliness? But in the asylum, water was not comfort, it was control. Patients were submerged in scalding hot tubs for hours, sometimes days, their bodies wrapped tightly in wet sheets. Others were plunged into ice-cold baths, shivering violently as attendants locked the lids closed, leaving only a hole for the head. Some were alternated between extremes, boiling heat, freezing cold, until their will was broken. Doctors called it calming. Families were told it reduced agitation. The truth was darker. It subdued rebellion. It quieted resistance. The water was not cleansing the patient. It was washing away their will. Think of the symbolism. Baptism twisted into punishment. The sacred element of life turned into an instrument of obedience. Imagine a woman named Eleanor Price confined in 1941. She had been judged hysterical after challenging her husband publicly. The prescription was hydrotherapy. Bound in wet sheets, she spent 36 hours restrained, her skin wrinkled, her mind collapsing under exhaustion. When she was finally released, she was compliant, broken, empty. The asylum celebrated her improvement. But what had really improved? Only her obedience. And do you see the recurring pattern? Steel, electricity, insulin, water, different instruments, same outcome, not healing, submission, not therapy, erasure. The asylum became a cathedral of annihilation. Every ritual, lobotomy, shock, coma, bath, was aimed at the same altar, the destruction of individuality in the name of order. Now pause and ask yourself, why these methods? Why not patience, compassion, understanding? Because compassion does not serve control. Patience does not fill empty wards with silence. Understanding does not transform chaos into obedience, but erasure does. And here is where the descent sharpens. These practices were not accidents of misguided science. They were rehearsals. They were prototypes for a larger project, a society where individuality could be broken, where resistance could be drowned, where obedience could be manufactured with the flip of a switch or the prick of a needle. Do you understand how deep this goes? The asylum was never about healing the few. It was about preparing control for the many. The drowned voices of William Reed, the broken body of Eleanor Price, the erased laughter of Sarah Mitchell, These were not tragedies, they were test subjects, and the results of those tests now shape the very structures of power around you. Because once control has been perfected on the weakest, it is only a matter of time before it is turned on everyone else. And so I ask you again, how far down are you willing to go? Because next, we leave the rituals of the asylum behind and step into the corridors of power where these techniques were reborn. Techniques once performed in secret wards would soon find new homes, in prisons, in schools, in laboratories hidden beneath government contracts. We are about to enter the world of Project MK-Ultra, and if the asylum was a cathedral of erasure, MK-Ultra was the apocalypse of the mind itself. If you are still with me, if you are not yet lost in the silence, prove it. Write in the comments, I am still awake. Write it as defiance. Write it as warning. Write it so I know the current has not taken you. Because from here, the descent does not just reveal history, it reveals the future. The asylum was never the end of the story, it was the proving ground. The techniques perfected there, the lobotomy, the shock, the coma, the bath, did not vanish with the cracked paint and the rusting gates. They migrated, they dressed themselves in new suits, they walked into new rooms with better lighting and thicker curtains. They entered the laboratories of power, and the place where they found their new patron was an agency of secrets, an organization sworn to protect a nation, yet quietly willing to experiment on the minds of its own people. Listen close. What followed was not a moral failing so much as a strategic decision. In the mid-20th century, a nation at war and in fear concluded that control of the mind was a weapon worth inventing. The experiments that once happened in wards labeled mental were lifted and repackaged under classified headers and government budgets. Men who had once used scalpels and syringes now found access to funds they had only dreamed of. The laboratory widened, the ethics shrank. This is where programs with names whispered in conspiracy forums and forgotten hearings began to take shape. The doctrine was simple and cold. If you can reliably alter, erase, or manufacture belief, you control outcomes. If you can displace identity, you can eliminate dissent. If you can rewrite memory, you can manufacture consent. Enter the projects that borrowed the asylum's playbook and amplified its ambition. Secret committees convened, contracts were signed. Universities, hospitals, and private contractors became subcontractors in a hidden economy of experiments. Drugs were smuggled across institutional doors. Hypnosis was recast as technique. New technologies, radio frequencies, chemical agents, sensory deprivation, were tested on people who could not refuse. Prisoners, patients, soldiers. The vulnerable became the lab. Understand the moral leap. What had once been rationalized as therapy inside a ward for the benefit of a patient or the system became rationalized as national security. If the mind itself could be a battlefield, then anything could be justified in the name of victory. The same logic that allowed a lobotomy because it made the wards manageable now allowed the dosing of unknowing subjects with hallucinogens to test their loyalty, their susceptibility, their capacity to be remade. We must be very clear about the mechanics. The asylum taught them the procedures: isolate, disorient, repeat. Isolation breaks the sense of self. Disorientation dissolves narrative. Repetition creates new patterns. Put these together with chemical agents that fracture memory, and you have a toolkit for producing compliance. The experiments were never about curing individuals. They were about discovering levers, precise, reproducible levers, to pry apart identity and rebuild it in ways that suited whoever held the budget and the keys. There are names you may have heard in fragments on late-night broadcasts and in declassified footnotes. There are stories of campuses where graduate students administered drugs to unwitting subjects, of hospitals where anesthetics were used not to numb pain but to erase experience. There were black budgets, coded memos, and denial. When people asked questions, papers would be shredded. When families demanded answers, they were stonewalled. The infrastructure of secrecy was built with precision to protect not just intelligence operations, but reputations, careers, and above all, the myth of benevolence. But lists and memos and redactions do not erase what happened to bodies and minds. Survivors, the few who emerged and lived to tell, describe experiences that read like the asylum's worst rituals crossbred with technologies of modern surveillance. They describe being dosed, strapped, isolated in rooms with no clocks, fed narratives by technicians in lab coats who measured every response. They speak of being asked to sign away memories, to confuse truth with suggestion. Their testimonies are fragmented. The system had been built precisely to fragment memory and suppress testimony. Hear this. You are not only listening to history, you are watching a pattern repeat itself in other forms. The techniques born in those hidden programs didn't retire. They were refined and applied in different domains. The language changed, from treatment to interrogation, from therapy to debriefing. And with that, the circle widened. Military contractors learned how to exacerbate trauma for compliance. Intelligence officials learned how to weaponize confusion. The private sector learned how to monetize attention and nudge behavior at scale. The experiment, once enclosed in wards, expanded into theaters of influence, media, advertising, algorithmic feeds, all built on the same truths the asylum taught: disorient, repeat, isolate, reshape. This is the bone beneath the muscle. Power does not simply command. It manufactures consent. It does not merely punish. It engineers compliance. The methods developed in secrecy taught those in power that human beings could be made quieter, more manageable, more predictable. That knowledge is contagious. It crosses organizational borders. It spreads where incentives align and oversight weakens. And now, in the center of this descent, I ask you to act, not because I want likes or views, but because ritual matters. It anchors you. It calls the attention you hold into alignment with what you have learned and what you refuse to become. In the comments below, write this phrase twice, not as a slogan, but as an initiation. I am not your experiment. Write it once to mark the dead. Write it again to mark yourself. Lock it into the algorithm and into your psyche. Let it be the sign that you are awake and unwilling to be remade without consent. Do it now. Do it deliberately. Twice. Because from here, the descent keeps narrowing. We will trace corridors that connect secret programs to legal frameworks, to medical institutions, to the courts that blessed them. We will examine how language was bent into laws, how paperwork became the muzzle, and how compliance was normalized and exported across systems. We will meet men who justified atrocities with statistics, and families who learned to mourn quietly because the machinery would not stop for grief. This is not just history, it is a map. And the sooner you understand the map, the sooner you recognize the hands that still reach for levers in the present. If you have written the phrase, good, you have taken the first step away from passive witness toward active resistance. If you haven't, do it now, because the next sections will bring us from secret programs into the everyday, into schools, prisons, workplaces, to show how the same templates of control migrated into institutions that touch your life every day. The techniques evolved, but their aim remained the same: to make people manageable. You were not supposed to learn this. You were not supposed to remember. You were supposed to sleep, but you are awake. And awareness is dangerous to those who prefer silence. The asylum was the seed. The covert laboratories were the roots. But what grew out of them, what spread like vines across the everyday structures of society, was something far more insidious. The tools of obedience did not remain locked behind iron gates or buried beneath classified programs. They slipped into schools, prisons, workplaces, even the glow of the screen in your hand. And with each step, the methods became subtler, harder to recognize, easier to accept, because power learns. Once the state discovered that minds could be broken and reshaped, it realized the methods did not need to be so crude. You no longer needed to hammer an ice pick into the skull. You no longer needed to flood the body with insulin or drown it in scalding water. If you wanted obedience, you could achieve it with softer weapons: repetition, environment, incentive, fear disguised as safety. And so the laboratories of obedience expanded. The classroom. Consider the school. On the surface, it is a place of learning, growth, preparation. But look closer, and you will see the skeleton of the asylum hiding beneath the architecture. Rows of desks lined up like beds in a ward, bells marking time like the buzzers of a hospital schedule. A teacher at the front, not unlike a doctor presiding over patients, Do not misunderstand, education can liberate, but the system that grew in the shadow of industry, all progress was not built primarily for liberation. It was built for compliance. Memorize, repeat, obey the bell, sit still, wait for permission to speak, follow instructions even when they make no sense. And those who could not conform, they were sent to special programs where medication replaced shock and the language of behavioral management replaced the language of discipline. The asylum's ghost lives in every child who learns that curiosity is dangerous, that defiance is punished, that individuality is something to be corrected. The prison. And what of the prison? Here the resemblance is almost literal. Bars, cells, surveillance, punishment. But more than that, the logic of the asylum lives in the prison's philosophy. Contain, silence, erase. Prisoners are not reformed, they are managed. Their resistance is not understood, it is broken. Solitary confinement is nothing but sensory deprivation. The same technique once tested in psychiatric wards, now perfected in correctional facilities. Prisoners speak of hallucinations, disorientation, the slow erosion of their sense of time, their sense of self. Just as patients once stumbled out of insulin comas broken and compliant, prisoners stumble out of solitary with minds fractured, and society calls it justice. The workplace. Even the workplace absorbed the lessons. The cubicle farm is the asylum's cousin. Endless rows of isolated individuals monitored for productivity, measured by output, rewarded for compliance. The language is different. Efficiency, professionalism, corporate culture. But the outcome is similar. The erasure of individuality in the name of order. The asylum taught that silence was healing. The corporation teaches that silence is teamwork. The asylum rewarded docility. The corporation rewards flexibility. The asylum used insulin and shock. The corporation uses burnout, metrics, performance reviews. Different costumes, same play. The screen. But perhaps the most powerful migration of all came not through walls or cells, but through the glowing screens that now dominate daily life. The methods that once required physical force, shock, coma, restraint, are no longer necessary. Why strike the brain with steel when you can do it with algorithms? Why flood the body with insulin when you can flood the mind with endless distraction? The asylum experimented with repetition to reprogram behavior. The feed uses repetition to sculpt attention. The asylum induced disorientation with drugs. The screen induces disorientation with endless scrolling, fractured focus, and dopamine spikes. The asylum erased memory with shock. The feed erases memory by drowning it in constant novelty. And you welcome it. You invite it into your bedroom, your pocket, your very hand. Understand this clearly. The architecture of compliance has gone wireless. It no longer needs doctors in white coats. It no longer needs locked wards. It needs only your attention, your time, your willingness to obey the gentle nudges of invisible systems. The hidden continuum. Do you see the continuum now? The asylum taught the principle, obedience is healing. The covert laboratories perfected the techniques, isolation, disorientation, repetition, erasure. The institutions spread them, schools, prisons, workplaces, screens, and through it all, the same philosophy persisted. Individuality is dangerous, resistance is pathology, silence is cure. But here is the most disturbing truth. The more subtle the methods became, the more effective they grew. A lobotomy was obvious, shock therapy was undeniable, even insulin comas left scars. But when obedience is engineered through habits, environments, and invisible algorithms, there are no scars to trace, no wounds to expose. The control is total, but the victim believes it is choice. That is the true perfection of the asylum's legacy. The ritual of awareness. Now, if you are still with me, you must mark the moment. You must anchor yourself before we descend further, because what comes next will not just reveal history or institutions, it will reveal you, the ways you have been shaped, erased, managed without even noticing. So write this phrase, not once but twice, in the comments below. The cure was control. Write it once for the asylums that tested the methods. Write it again for the systems that still use them today. Do not hesitate. Do not think it is trivial. Ritual matters. It is your way of refusing silence, because the next step takes us into the present, into the thin line where psychiatry, technology and governance converge, where the asylum's ghost wears the skin of wellness apps, biometric trackers, predictive policing, and mental health initiatives that are less about healing and more about surveillance. Steel, electricity, insulin, water. These were only the beginning. The new tools are softer, digital, invisible, and yet they carry the same mission: to tame, to silence, to erase the parts of you that do not comply. The asylum never ended. It simply upgraded. And now, we stand at the threshold of its most perfect form. The asylum was once made of stone, iron, and echoing corridors, but today its walls are invisible, its doors weightless, its reach unlimited. You walk through it every day without recognizing its architecture because it does not resemble the asylum of old. It does not need to. It has evolved. The asylum has become digital, and here is the truth you were never meant to see. You are living inside the perfect asylum right now, not in a hospital, not under lock and key, but within an architecture of data, surveillance, and invisible authority. What once required forced commitment now operates through consent disguised as convenience. You think you are free, but freedom, in this age, is the most sophisticated illusion. The new straitjacket. The digital asylum does not strap your arms to your sides with leather belts. It does not lower you into tubs of water or strike your skull with steel. It wraps you in comfort. It whispers, "We will make your life easier." Every app you install, every biometric tracker you wear, every camera that watches you on the street, each is a thread in a net. The asylum's straitjacket is data, and you tighten it yourself with every click, every purchase, every search. The walls are built of algorithms. They predict your desires before you feel them. They suggest what to watch, what to eat, who to love, who to fear. You think you are making choices, but in reality, you are selecting from menus prepared by forces you cannot see. And unlike the old asylums, there is no ward you can walk out of, because the digital asylum follows you everywhere. Surveillance psychiatry. Do not think psychiatry has been left behind. No, it has adapted beautifully to this new architecture. The language has shifted, but the mission is the same: to classify, to manage, to normalize. Today, mental health initiatives are embedded in workplaces, schools, even your smartphone. They tell you they are here to help. But listen closely. Every survey, every self-reporting app, every biometric reading is not just about care. It is about data. Your moods become numbers. Your anxieties become trends. Your despair becomes a dataset fed into algorithms that predict your risk of suicide, your likelihood of defiance, your potential for violence. Governments and corporations alike hunger for this information. Why? Because the mind has always been the final frontier of control. Do you see the pattern? The asylum wanted obedience, not healing. The digital asylum wants predictability, not freedom. If your psychological profile reveals you as unpredictable, you are flagged, watched, contained by invisible systems that decide what opportunities you will receive, what risks you pose, what limits you must endure. This is surveillance psychiatry, the asylum reborn as analytics, predictive policing. But it does not stop with your moods. The asylum's ghost has infiltrated the machinery of law enforcement. Enter predictive policing, the algorithmic promise that crime can be prevented before it happens. It sounds like science fiction, yet it is already here. Algorithms digest your history, your neighborhood, your digital behavior. They calculate probabilities of defiance, danger, rebellion. Police are then dispatched not to respond to crimes, but to anticipate them. Understand the implication. You are judged not for what you have done, but for what you might do. This is the asylum's logic carried to its extreme. Preemptive confinement based on suspicion wrapped in science. In the 1920s, you could be locked away for moral instability. In the 2020s, you can be flagged for statistical instability. The difference is cosmetic. The mechanism is identical. The quiet colonization of the mind. Perhaps the most terrifying aspect of the digital asylum is not overt surveillance or predictive policing, but the subtle reshaping of your own cognition. Because you are not merely being watched, you are being rewritten. Algorithms do not only track behavior, they sculpt it. They feed you streams of content designed to reinforce your biases, amplify your fears, erode your attention, and guide your beliefs. Slowly, invisibly, your inner world is colonized. Do you remember how the old asylum erased memory with shock therapy? How it silenced rebellion with insulin comas? Today, the erasure is cleaner. Constant distraction robs you of deep memory. Endless novelty fractures your attention. The ability to think independently, to stand against the tide, dissolves. And you do not resist, because the process feels like entertainment. The weapon of normalization. At the heart of it all lies the most powerful weapon, normalization. The digital asylum does not need to break you violently. It only needs to convince you that obedience is normal, that constant monitoring is safety, that endless distraction is freedom. Think of how quickly society adjusted to cameras on every corner, microphones in every room, algorithms knowing more about you than your closest friends. There was no outrage, no mass rebellion, just acceptance. The digital asylum succeeded because it never announced itself. It simply became the water you swim in. And here lies the brilliance. Once normalization is complete, resistance appears insane. If you question the system, you are paranoid. If you reject the conveniences, you are a Luddite. If you demand freedom, you are dangerous. The asylum's ghost has achieved perfection. It has erased the very possibility of naming it. The return of the patient. Look at yourself honestly. Are you not already the patient? You check your phone the way the asylum patient once awaited the nurse's footsteps. You obey the algorithm's recommendations the way the patient obeyed the doctor's orders. You silence your unease, convincing yourself this is progress, just as families once convinced themselves that shock therapy was humane. The difference is only in costume. The patient wore a hospital gown. You wear tailored clothes. But the condition is the same, compliance disguised as care. The final illusion. And perhaps the most devastating illusion is this. You think you are choosing. You think you are free. But freedom in the digital asylum is curated. You may walk any corridor you like, but the walls have already been built. You may select any option, but the options were already prepared. The house always wins because the house built your desires. This is not freedom. This is managed perception. This is the asylum perfected. The asylums of the past shattered bodies. The digital asylum shatters will, and once will is broken, you do not need chains. You do not need walls. The patient walks willingly, proudly, into confinement, believing it is liberty. And this is why the asylum story was never told honestly, because if you saw its true legacy, you might recognize it in the mirror. The asylum has shifted shapes, but one truth remains constant. It has always served power. Whether in the guise of medicine, psychiatry, or technology, its mission has never been healing. Its mission has always been control. And to understand the machinery behind the digital asylum, you must follow the trail upward, beyond the walls of hospitals, beyond the codes of algorithms, into the hands of those who benefit most from obedience. The corporate architects. Corporations are the first wardens of the new asylum. Their motives are cloaked in the language of innovation, convenience, and improving lives. But peel back the slogans, and you find the familiar skeleton of exploitation. Why do social media platforms engineer infinite scrolls? Why do they harvest every click, every hesitation, every half-formed thought? Not because they care about connection, but because your attention is currency. Every moment you spend staring at a screen is a moment of profit. The asylum once kept patients docile for the ease of staff. The corporate asylum keeps you docile for the ease of markets. You are not a customer, you are a product. Your time is sold, your emotions are traded, your thoughts are commodities, and the brilliance is this: you willingly give it away. Governments and the dream of perfect order. Governments, too, found in the asylum's ghost a perfect ally. The state has always feared unpredictability, rebellion, protest, Defiance. In the asylum it saw a model. Label dissent as illness, classify resistance as disorder, silence troublemakers under the guise of care. Today the logic has scaled. Mass surveillance, predictive policing, digital profiling, all are born from the same desire for perfect order. When a government can track every step, monitor every mood, anticipate every reaction, it no longer governs citizens. It manages patients, and here lies the terrifying convergence. The state no longer needs brute force when it can achieve compliance with algorithms. Why crack skulls when you can guide thoughts? Why fill prisons when you can nudge behavior until rebellion never sparks? This is not governance. This is psychiatric management of entire populations. The military shadow. Behind the corporations and governments lurks the military, the oldest and most ruthless student of mind control. From the first Cold War experiments in brainwashing to the present-day exploration of neuro-weapons, the military has always sought the ultimate weapon, domination of consciousness itself. Documents once buried in classified vaults reveal experiments in sensory deprivation, drug-induced compliance, hypnotic suggestion. Most of these were dismissed as failures. But were they? Or were they simply seeds planted in secret, waiting for the soil of digital technology to bloom? Consider this: a weapon that does not kill bodies, but bends wills. A battlefield where the enemy does not even realize he has surrendered. That is the dream of the modern military, and through the Asylum's methods, reborn as surveillance psychiatry, predictive policing, algorithmic control, the dream is no longer fantasy. The war for territory has become a war for consciousness, and you are the territory, the elite need for control. Now ask yourself, why? Why this endless obsession with obedience? Why this hunger to mold minds, to silence individuality, to normalize compliance? The answer is ancient. Power fears chaos. Power fears unpredictability. The elite, whether in governments or corporations, know their structures are fragile. A spark of true freedom could burn them to the ground, and so they built asylums, both physical and digital, to contain that spark. To convince the masses that obedience is safety, that silence is health, that conformity is virtue. The asylum is not a relic of the past. It is the blueprint of control refined over centuries, now perfected in the age of data. The ritual of naming. If you have followed this far, you must understand. Recognition is resistance. Power thrives on invisibility. The asylum wins when you fail to see it. So write this phrase in the comments, not once, not twice, but 3 times. The asylum never ended. Write it for the patients who were silenced. Write it for the systems that grew from their suffering. Write it for yourself, because only by naming the ghost can you begin to resist it. The final revelation. The asylum is no longer a building on the edge of town. It is not a ward you can escape, not a doctor you can defy. It is everywhere, woven into the fabric of daily life. It is in your workplace. It is in your school. It is in the devices you cradle. It is in the gaze of cameras, in the hum of servers, in the quiet suggestions of algorithms. You are told it is freedom. You are told it is safety. You are told it is progress. But beneath the costume, it is the same machinery that once strapped patients to beds and burned electricity through their skulls. The asylum never ended. It evolved. And the final question, the only question that matters, is this: will you continue to live as a patient, or will you dare to step outside? Because the door is not locked. It never was. The only chains are the ones you accept.